Hey everybody, it's Dan the Chess Enthusiast, and I'm here with my Grandmaster game for the French Advanced variation. Today's game was played between Buddy Spassky as white and Viktor Korchnoi as black in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1999. At the time, Spassky was rated 2549 and Korchnoi was rated 2673. I chose this game because it has a deviation from the main line that I thought was interesting and which I didn't cover in my last video, and also because at the end Korchnoi was able to get a nice checkmate to end the game. So just getting into the game here, we have the French defense, the advanced variation, what I talked about in my last video. And in fact, this game follows all of the book moves from that video up until this point, when on move 6, Spassky plays a3. Now this is known as the Paulson variation. The idea here is to prep b4, which would gain white space on the queen side while forcing black to release the tension on d4 either by capturing or moving the pawn. So now black really has two responses, a5 and c4. In the game, we see a4, but let's look briefly at c4. So the most commonly played move in this position nowadays after c4 is the knight on b to d2 from white. Black responds with knight on a5, which looks odd, but the knight is keeping the b2 pawn from pushing forward and breaking up black's nice pawn presence in the center. We have some development moves with the bishops, and then castling, and then the knight on e7 developments with rook to e1 from white, and then h6. Now, this move is important because black is going to castle long, and h6 keeps the white knight from pivoting on g5 to f7, which would then fork black's rooks. From here, white plays rook to b1, and black does castle long. And this, as we can see, is a complex position, but according to theory, it has slightly better possibilities for white. So c4 is actually a bit more kind of fashionable these days. But if we go back now, so after the pawn to a3, what was played in the game is actually pawn to a5. From here, we have bishop to d3, and then bishop to d7. And white here pulls the bishop back to c2, and black plays h6. I think white is going to be castling, I think black plays this move because white is going to be castling kingside and black queenside, so black is initiating an attack already. From here, white does castle, and then black plays knight to h6. But I'm actually going to stop here because the computer actually liked a different move in this position. The computer preferred c captures d in this position. And from here, white can recapture, and then black pushes g5. Once the knight captures, the queen comes in on d4, taking away white's center. White plays bishop to d3 to avoid the queen exchange, and black gets white's other center pawn. White develops the knight, which is also blocking the queen's pressure on b2, so now white can develop its dark square bishop. Black puts the queen on g7, and white retreats the knight. Black develops knight on g to e7, which is clearing the way for the rook to get behind the queen. White moves the king to the corner, and black finally castles long. White plays bishop to g5. Black scoots the king over. White puts the rook on the e-file. Black puts its rook next to the king, and this position right here, the computer scored almost dead equal. Well, okay, actually it has a slight advantage for black. Whereas if we go back here to the game, when black played knight to h6, the computer actually scored this move as almost half a pawn advantage for white in this position. So to continue now with the game, after knight to h6, white plays rook to a2, and this is putting a defender on b2 and allowing the dark squared bishop to move now. Black develops its other bishop, and white puts its bishop as a defender of the d4 square. Black here plays knight to f5 to attack the bishop, and white gives up the bishop pair by capturing the knight. Black recaptures, and then we have a couple of exchanges on c5 and then a4 from white. Here, black plays bishop to e6, which is threatening a discovered attack on the rook on a2. So, to prevent that, white plays knight to d4 to stop the pawn from advancing. Now, this drops the pawn on e5, but according to the computer, this isn't that big of a deal. In fact, going forward, white maintains for a while more a slight advantage, nothing really even worth examining, But the point is that the loss of the pawn in this position doesn't seem to be a problem. And I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps because white still has some nice piece activity in the position. But if anyone else out there has any ideas why losing the pawn on e5 isn't a problem for white, I'd love to hear them because I just couldn't figure it out. So moving on, white plays knight to d2, and black responds with knight to g4, and then white here plays rook to e1, threatening to win a pawn with check on e6. Black plays a good move here, queen to d6, which is both protecting e6 and threatening a nice check on h2. To counter this, white plays knight on the second to f3, but when I saw this move, I actually was curious, why not play the move g3 to shut down the queen's pressure on that diagonal? I know that in my own games, I frequently make a pawn move like that without really thinking about it or its implications for later in the game. So I looked at it with the computer and what that would lead to, and I'll show you what it looks like. But basically, after g3, with black's pawns on f5 and h5, if white plays g3, it'll be fairly easy for black to open up the king side for an attack. In this position, the computer has black castling, and then white playing knight on the second to f3 to prevent h4. Black puts the bishop on d7, so that when white plays knight to b5, attacking the queen, black can just take that piece off, and when white recaptures, black pushes f4. And this is as far as I looked in this variation, but again, the point is that we can see that it's going to be difficult for white here to keep the king safe. So that's why I think going back to this position for white, white chose to play knight on the second to f3, because I've heard, and probably a lot of you guys know, that you always want to be very, very thoughtful in making a pawn move, because pawns are the only piece they can't move backwards. So you definitely want to think long and hard before making a pawn move like that, because it is a very committal move. So continuing with the game here, black castles, and white kicks the knight with h3. The knight jumps to f6, and here white doesn't make a blunder, but starting with the next move, white loses some of its advantage. Up until this point, the computer has white with an advantage of even up to almost a full pawn in some places. But from now on, white is only going to be able to equalize once or twice, and will never again in this game get the advantage. Here, white plays knight captures e6, allowing black to recapture and have a nice pawn presence in the center of the board. White now plays queen to d4, and black here responds with rook on a to c8. White puts the knight on e5, and black plays knight to d7, and the knights come off the board. Now here, white's next move is really where things start to go downhill. White plays b3, and while it gives the rook on a2 lateral access and strengthens a4, the problem with this move is that it now weakens c3, and black immediately jumps on that. Black adds an attacker to c3, forcing white to play rook to c2. Here, black puts its other rook in an active position on f6, and white plays rook to e5. Now this is another move that I don't really understand, since the rook isn't attacking anything that it can capture anyway, and in this position it only has the option to retreat. In fact, the computer scoring this position scored it as almost a full point advantage for black, and preferred to rook to e5 the move c4. I'm actually not going to get into that just because I don't want this video to take forever. I'm actually going to just continue with the game. But if you have any thoughts on this position, on why white played this move, do let me know. So here black plays queen to c5, offering a queen exchange, and white declines by playing queen to d3, which still keeping a close eye on c3. Now here we're going to see that white seems to have a fundamental weakness in its position, because black is able to just pose one threat after another. Black continues playing aggressively with queen to b6, attacking b3. White pushes c4, allowing the queen to defend b3, but black now plays queen to a6, putting pressure on c4. White counters with queen to d2, which is basically saying, if you want my pawn on c4, I get your pawn on a5. However, black here just attacks white's rook, and white defends with f4. The problem is that this move opens up the diagonals of the king, and black immediately hits the check, forking the king in b3. The only response for white is rook to e3, and from here, black captures dc, and when white recaptures rook to d8, wrapping up the pressure even more. Now, in the game, white blundered and played queen to f2, which loses fairly quickly. There was one more move, though, in this position, and if you want, you can pause the video and see if you can find it. It's actually not that hard to find, I think, and I'm a little surprised that somebody of Spassky's caliber missed it. But then again, you know, we all blunder sometimes, and I know that I do much more often than Spassky. So, anyway, just go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find the move. So the move here that Spassky missed is queen to e1. This is still protecting both the back rank and the rook on e3. From here, the game could continue with black playing queen to d4, white consolidating with rook to c3, but then black gets the pawn on f4. Both sides can then exchange some pieces on e6. Black pushes the king out of check, and white plays rook to e3, getting ready to protect the back rank. Black pushes h4, white puts the rook on e1, again protecting the back rank, and then black hits the check with the queen, and white moves out of the check. Black now gets ready to check on h3, and white is pretty much forced into a queen exchange. And after a few more pawns come off the board, the computer scores this position right here. The computer scores this position as almost a 1.5 advantage for black. It's not exactly crushing, but white would still be in an uphill battle from here. But, like I said, that wasn't what was played in the game. In the game, in this position, Spassky played queen to f2, and now Korchnoi pretty much has the game all wrapped up, although we do see the checkmate instead of a resignation. So black here hits the check, and white is forced to retreat the king to h2, because moving, say, in this position, the rook to block the check just ends up losing the rook. So after the king retreats to h2, black adds more firepower to white's back rank. White attacks the queen, but black actually ignores this and hits a check with the rook. White retreats to g3, and black hits another check. And white once again chooses the worst of the two moves and plays king to h4. White's alternative in this position was actually king to f3, but while that still leads to a hopelessly losing position, it's not a mating net like what white wound up in during the game. Real quickly, if we have king to f3, then we have a check, rook to e2 to block, and then rook to f1 winning the queen. And while the computer actually goes on for a few more moves, I think in this position right here you can see that white is just lost in this position. So anyway, going back here to this position, white again chooses the worst of the two moves and plays king to h4. And if you want to, you can pause the video and try to find black's winning combination. From this position, there's a mate in 7, but white in the game actually gave black a mate in 2. So first I'll show you the mate in 7 that the computer found, and then the way the game actually finished. For the mate in 7, if you haven't already and you want to, pause now because here comes the solution. So we have the queen playing to d1, which is threatening mate on g4 with the queen, but also queen to d8 check, which would also lead to a mate in 2. Queen to g3 is actually the best way to handle both threats, because the queen is now set to defend g4, but also blocks a check on g5 if the queen moves to d8. Here we have a key move, rook to g4 check, resisting the urge to capture the queen, because while that would certainly be winning, it's not the fastest way to mate. For example, if rook captures g3, the rook recaptures, and again, black is up in material, but there's no winning combination in this position. So after black checks in this position, we have king captures on h5, and then the black king moves to h7, which is cutting off any further escape routes for white. From here we have rook captures on e6, which is pretty much forced, because g6 in this position is mate, and so white needs the rook to defend against that. We have rook captures on g3 check. White can play rook on b to e2 to block the check. We have the queen capturing with another check, and after the rook captures, g6 in this position hits a check, forcing the king back to h4, and then we have rook to g4, which is checkmate. And that is actually the mate in 7 that the computer found, but that's not actually the route that was played in the game. what was played in the game, if we go back to this position right here, is after queen to d1, we have the queen playing to e2 to block the check, but this actually just leads to a mate in 2. If you want to, you can pause the video to try to find it, but I'm just going to go ahead with the solution right now. We have queen to d8 check, which forces king captures h5, and then rook to h6 is actually checkmate, and that's how the game ends. So that is the Grandmaster game for the French Advanced. 2 legends of chess, Spassky and Korchnoi, and what I thought was a pretty good game. Spassky obviously slipped up towards the end, but I think it was Kasparov who said something like, the winner is usually the player who didn't make the last mistake, and that was certainly true in this case. So anyway, if you have any questions or comments, those are welcome, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you later. Alright, thanks for watching. Take care.